to the advisory board. A big welcome to all of you. We have more than several hundred requests to participate in this webinar, and for reasons of capacity and stability, we were only able to welcome the first 150 persons who signed up for this meeting on Teams. But our webinar is also streamed on the advisory board's website. So also a warm welcome to those of you following us there today. This is a public webinar, so we will be recording the meeting for streaming and also to be able to share it on our website afterwards. In a moment, I will hand over the floor to the chair of the advisory board, Professor Ottmar Edenhofer, who will present the key findings of the advisory board's new report. And following the presentation, we will have a Q&A session where you will have the possibility to ask questions about the report and its conclusions. We will have to conclude the meeting sharp at 4 o'clock, but that still leaves us an hour and 25 minutes to dive in the report and discuss its recommendations. As a word of introduction to those of you who are maybe not familiar with the advisory board yet, the European Scientific Advisory Board on Climate Change is an independent body providing the European Union with scientific findings, scientific knowledge, expertise, and advice relating to climate change. The advisory board evaluates policies and identify actions and opportunities to achieve the EU's climate targets. It was established in 2021 by the European Climate Law, and it consists of 15 independent senior scientific experts covering a broad range of disciplines. In 2023, the advisory board published its recommendations for a 2040 greenhouse gas target for the EU. And today's presentation will focus on another important piece of work of the advisory board, a report published last week and titled Towards EU Climate Neutrality, Progress, Policy Gaps and Opportunities. So now I would like to invite Professor Edenhofer, the chair of the advisory board, to take the floor and present these recommendations.
Yeah, thank you very much, François. Good afternoon also from my side. I would like to check, can you hear me now in an appropriate way?
Yes, we can hear you well.
Good, wonderful. Yeah, it's a great pleasure to start to present this report towards EU climate neutrality. And in this report, we talk about progress, policy, gaps, and opportunities. And let me highlight a few aspects of the underlying context and approach. So the Paris Agreement is about the 1.5 degree limit. And in this perspective, the EU aims for climate neutrality by 2050 at the latest, and at least 55 net reduction by 2030 compared to the 90 level. As François already mentioned, so in this context, we have already published last year our report on the 2040 targets. So based on this recommendation, we assessed the EU's progress and the consistency of the EU and the national measures toward the climate neutrality goal. So in this report, we do not focus on new targets. Here we focus indeed on gaps. So let me highlight an important aspect, so that this report is published in the context of the first global stocktake, which is a call for acceleration action with deep, rapid, and sustained greenhouse gas emissions. And we have within the EU two important policy cycles connected but at different stage. The first one is the 2030 target, the Fit for 55, which is already in place. And here we are in the process of implementation. And the second policy cycle is the EU's climate neutrality objective, the upcoming decisions on the EU's 2040 target, then on the next policy framework post 2030. And it is also worthwhile to mention that in June we have the EU elections, and in that sense, this report is already an input to the new European Commission and the European Parliament by the end of 2024. Now, as I mentioned, this report is not about new targets. It is about gaps. And we start with the needs, what is needed to happen for the EU to remain on track to climate goals. But these goals are already set, basically, at least. And here we identified the gaps, and we have distinguished the following gaps. The first one is policy gaps. So when there is no policy in place, an ambition gap. When a policy is in place, but insufficiently ambitious, implementation gap, when there is poor implementation, and policy consistency. And here we refer to the policies in place, but they could be potentially counterproductive. And then based on the comparison between the needs and the gaps, we come up with recommendations. So this is not a report which is necessarily a report that we want to be pessimistic or we want to be in a negative mood. It's just to explain carefully so where are the gaps and what are the steps for further improvement. In this report, we have evaluated the relevant sectors, the energy supply sector, industry, transport, building, agriculture, and LULUCF. So these sectors then are embedded in cross-cutting chapters, which refer to enabling conditions. And here we have identified the following: pricing emissions and rewarding removals, just transition and public engagement, finance and investment, innovation, governance, and we conclude with skills and capacity building. So in this report, we do not identify the gaps within the sectors, but also in the cross-cutting policy frameworks. Now let me outline with here a little bit our method. We start, so to say, with the required greenhouse gas emission reductions. So the expected contribution of each sector towards minus 55% by 2030 and climate neutrality by 2050. So then we move on to analyze the outcomes, the main results to be achieved on the demand and at the supply side. So, and in the third level, we refer to the changes that can deliver the desired outcome. And in the last step, we have embedded this perspective into the enabling conditions, changes that can facilitate or are crucial to the activation of the different levels. So here we refer in particular to cross-cutting themes, but also to sector-specific policies. So this is an example for transport. Here you can see the overarching goal in the sector, the outcomes, demand and supply side, the mitigation levels, demand moderation, model shift, uptake of zero-emission vehicles, and so on. And then the enabling conditions, infrastructure, digitalization, price signals, spatial planning, and so on. So, and this here we have developed specific indicators to analyze the report. For example, greenhouse gas emissions, the average greenhouse gas intensity of new vehicles, or the percentage of fossil fuels in total, and so on. So that these are carefully selected indicators which allows us to describe the progress so far. Now this brings me now to my next step. So what can we say about the overarching progress? And so here it is worthwhile to mention that the EU has succeeded in structurally reducing its greenhouse gas emission and even overachieving its 2020 target. The pace of reduction needs to double to achieve the 2030 target, and then to increase further to achieve the recommended 90 to 95% reduction objective. Currently, and planned policies are expected to accelerate the pace of reduction in the coming years and bringing the EU very close to the 2030 target. So the 2030 target is definitely within reach. However, a large gap looms after 2030. So as the pace of reduction is projected to slow down when it should actually accelerate. And this highlights the need for an even stronger policies after 2030 to sustain and even increase the pace of reduction towards 2040 and 2050. I think that's the basic message. So we are close to the 2030 target, but then we will lose the momentum. Now, therefore, what we did here is in this report, we focused on the reduction of the 2030 target, but also we analyzed the gap for the 90 to 95% reduction towards the net zero target. So, and along these lines, we have organized our recommendations in the following way. So in one dimension, we are talking about the net reduction by 2030 and towards net zero by 2050. And also then in the second dimension, we have grouped recommendations which should be implemented now or well before 2030, and also then by 2031 at the latest. So this brings us to 4 sets of recommendations. The short-term actions, here we have 5 recommendations. The short-term actions to support the achievement of climate neutrality objective, 5 recommendations. And then we have the long-term recommendations, actions, which should be prepared for implementation by 2031 to support the achievement of climate neutrality. So we have 13 recommendations, and now I would like to guide you through these recommendations. Let me start with the first set of recommendations, which is focused on the 55 net reduction by 2030, and which is focused on the timeline before 2030. So let me highlight them. So here we recommend the implementation of Fit for 55 fully and swiftly. We conclude that the revision of the Energy Tax Directive and other European Green Deal initiatives are necessary. We recommend to provide a stable investment outlook for renewables. And last but not least, the phase out of fossil fuel subsidies. So let me start with the first set here. So the Fit for 55 package represents an ambitious policy framework to achieve 2030 target. However, its delivery largely depends on action at the national level. And for example, the effort sharing regulation and the LULUCF regulation set binding national objectives that need to be achieved through ambitious national policies. For example, the achievement of renewable energy and energy sufficiency objectives depend on national measures and levels. In 2023, member states submitted their drafts, updated the national energy climate plans that should have been brought in line with the Fit for 55 package. Although they represent some progress, we see that their collective ambition is still insufficient to achieve the 2030 target. We are very close to the overall minus 55 objective, but more ambition is needed in the effort sharing regulation and in the LULUCF sectors. In particular, with regard to energy efficiency, there is much homework to be done in the member states, because here we see the largest gap here. So as 2030 is only 7 years away from now, time is running, and therefore we recommend the member states to ensure that the final updated national energy and climate plans to be submitted in June of this year are fully aligned with the agreed 2030 objective. And also we recommend to rapidly adopt and implement the different national measures set out in those national energy and climate plans. So the next slide, please. So we also recommend that EU should adopt pending legislation aimed at supporting greenhouse gas reductions. Over the last 3 years, the EU has adopted an impressive number of ambitious policies to put us on track towards 2030 objective. However, the work is not yet fully done. The revision of the Energy Taxation Directive, which is an integral part of the Fit for 55, is not yet adopted. And as a result, energy taxation continues to undermine the climate transition, for example, by providing exemption for aviation fuels. And also a number of initiatives under the European Deal sector strategies are not yet concluded or even proposed by the Commission. So therefore, we recommend EU policymakers not to stop before the finish line and to adopt the remaining relevant legislation, and in particular, an ambitious revision of the Energy Taxation Directive. So the next set of recommendation refers to the stable investment outlook for renewables. This is a quite clear goal for solar PV and wind power. It needs an upscaling, but several bottlenecks hinder the deployment of renewables. So adopt the pending legislation, Net Zero Industry Act, electricity market reform, a rapidly implementation of recent legislation, provide a stable support mechanism for renewables, offer a long-term market outlook, and find a balance between the least cost solution and the required technological innovation. So the next recommendation highlights the importance of an urgently and fully phase out of fossil fuel subsidies, which should be in line with the existing commitments. Despite of the repeated commitments, fossil fuel subsidies persist and even surged in 2022 in the context of the energy crisis following the Russia's war of aggression against the Ukraine. This short-term support in the context of the energy crisis is understandable, but most member states have not set a clear deadline to phase out such harmful subsidies. The report recommends the member states to set a clear plan to urgently and fully phase out these subsidies. So similarly, the EU state aid rules continue to allow public support for fossil fuels and should be brought in line with the EU climate goals. Now let me move on to the next 5 recommendations, which refers to short-term action to support the achievement of the climate neutrality goal by 2050. And here I refer to the following set of recommendations. An alignment of the EU policy with a phase out of fossil fuels is required. We recommend an assessment of socio-economic impacts of climate policy. And in particular, we request for an alignment of the common agricultural policy with the climate objective, a targeted deployment of carbon capture and utilization or storage, hydrogen and biogen is required towards the activities with no or limited alternatives, and also support of public and private climate investments has been identified as an important step. So let me start with the first one, the phase out of fossil fuels. So to achieve climate neutrality, a sharp decline in fossil fuel use by 2050 is required, and a full phase out in the electricity sector by 2040. Some EU policies are inconsistent with this phase out, like the EU taxonomy, the proposed gas directive, regulation on trans-European energy networks. So it is important that these policies are aligned with climate neutrality. And here the ensuring of consistency of the new policies is required. That we think that it is crucial that we check the consistency for climate neutrality, and the consistency checks done for many, but not for all relevant measures. So that's, from our point of view, a very important aspect. So then let me move on to the next one, which refers to the assessment of socioeconomic impacts of climate policy, ensuring a just and a fair transition. And here we recommend that climate action should be embedded in a broader welfare framework, identifying the benefits and the co-benefits of climate policy, but also analyzing the policies which have a regressive socioeconomic impact, and how to transform regressive climate policies in progressive climate policy, where the high income household bear a higher burden compared to the low income household. And such an impact need to be adequately addressed to ensure this just transition. We therefore recommend also to more systematically assess the socioeconomic impacts of climate policy, considering the specific context, arguing for transparency and including public consultation, reinforcing the synergies between the EU social and climate policies, help to design a compensatory measures such as the Social Climate Fund and Just Transition Fund, and also help to improve climate policy narratives, and also to invite member states to design reasonable compensation packages. Now here I think one of the more important things are to provide stronger incentives for climate action in the agriculture sector and in the food system. And what you can see here is very clearly that the emissions in the agriculture sector remain stable since 2005. And the common agricultural policy in the EU is important because its contribution to climate action is very uncertain at best. It continues to support greenhouse gas intensive activities such as livestock production, which is directly responsible for about 2/3 of total agricultural emissions. And it does include some green measures which could help reduce emissions, but these are largely voluntary and at the discretion of the member states. And the advisory report therefore recommends to use the upcoming revision of the common agricultural policy to better align it with the EU climate's ambition. And in parallel, the EU should also more strongly encourage healthier, more plant-based diets to avoid that lower livestock production just leads to higher imports from outside the EU. Now, in the next recommendation here, we refer to the CCU, CCS, hydrogen, and bioenergy. We acknowledge that we will need to use these mitigation options, pathways, for some applications where there are few to no other mitigation options. For example, cement production, international air and maritime transport. However, we should use them to reduce emission in sectors where we have other mitigations, which other mitigations are not available, or when direct electrification or efficiency improvement cannot be applied. In principle, the entire economy would subject to the same carbon price. We could expect the market to always prioritize the most efficient mitigation option. However, we have not such a price signal, and not all the sectors are subject to the same carbon price, and there are specific measures at the EU and the national level which provide support for this mitigation option. So in that sense, it is important that we have some kind of political prioritization in the sector, because CCU and CCS is not yet proven at scale. It is expensive and it has a risk to lock in to the fossil fuels. Hydrogen is very costly. Blue hydrogen relies also on CCS and the fossil fuels, and bioenergy raises important sustainability concerns. This is not to say we should not apply these technologies, but we should apply them and develop them and upscale them in this direction, where we cannot rely this as a silver bullet, but in particular, these options are needed in the hard to abate sectors. So we need also to increase public and private investments in climate mitigation. This goes without saying. The report identifies several policy gaps and related opportunities to help to achieve this increase. The EU aims to spend 30% of its regular budget under the multi-annual financial framework on climate action, which is a considerable amount of money. However, it should improve the methods to use to track progress toward this target. And the Recovery and the Resilience Facility, which is financed by common debt by EU member states, has substantially boosted public investment in climate transition, but it is foreseen to finish after 2026. And here, the establishment of a reliable investment environment is crucial and important. So this brings me to the last set of recommendations, actions to be prepared for implementation by 2031 to support the achievement of climate neutrality. And here we have identified, in particular, strengthening the governance and the compliance of the whole framework. So then make the EU emissions trading system fit for net zero, address energy and material demand, and expand emissions pricing to all major sectors, in particular to agriculture and food and LULUCF, and which is the other side of the coin, incentivize the carbon removals. So let me start with the first one, strengthening the compliance in the climate governance. So under the current government regulation, member states are required to develop long-term climate strategies and for the national energy and climate plans to be consistent with the long-term strategies. However, it does not foresee an iterative review process, similar ones for the national and energy climate plans, where member states first submit a draft that is revised by the European Commission, after which member states need to finalize national and energy and climate plans, taking into account the Commission recommendations. So we recommend to follow a similar approach for the long-term strategies in the future. The government regulation does also not mandate the EU Commission to check if the national energy and climate plans are actually consistent with the long-term strategies. So we recommend a more thorough check on this in the future. And finally, the regulations requirements regarding multi-level energy and climate dialogue are vague, and most member states have not established such dialogues on a permanent basis, and this should be improved to ensure a proper coordination between different stakeholder and governance levels in the member states. The European climate law invites member states to establish an independent national climate advisory body, but few member states have done so. And given the importance of an independent scientific input to guide the transition, we recommend the establishment of such national bodies. And finally, the compliance mechanism under the effort sharing regulation and LULUCF is weakened by the substantial time lag between emission and formal compliance checks. And this increases the risk that of the EU not meeting its overall reduction target. And therefore, we recommend to provide a stronger compliance mechanism for the sectors that are currently covered by these regulations. The next recommendation, make the two emission trading schemes fit for net zero. And this is a very important recommendation. So the existing EU ETS for stationary installations, which is basically the power sector and the industry sector, has improved significantly in the recent years. It's in a reasonably good shape. However, we need to start preparing for when the system's emission cap reaches zero. So this is the end game, so to say, which under the current directive would happen around 2039. Not all sectors covered by the system will be able to fully reduce their emissions by then, and we need to find a solution for this unavoidable residual emissions. So furthermore, free allocations is still used to shield sectors that are considered exposed to carbon leakage, but that are not yet covered by the carbon border adjustment mechanism. So this risk creating distortions could reduce also the incentive for mitigation action downstream the whole value chain. And therefore, we recommend the EU to start to develop alternatives for these sectors. For example, expanding the scope of the recently agreed carbon border adjustment mechanism. So for the new ETS2 for building and transport, so the EU policymakers have introduced a kind of a soft price cap, which limits the carbon price to 45 euros per ton CO2 in order to avoid harsh and social impacts and to limit the regressivity of the carbon price. However, it also creates a distortion, for example, by putting a lower carbon price on heating and transport fuels compared to heat pumps and electric cars that are covered in the EU ETS for installations. And therefore, we recommend aiming for a higher carbon price after 2030 that is consistent with an emission trajectory towards net zero, and to converge the carbon prices between EU ETS 2 and this emerging EU ETS, the EU ETS 1 and the emerging EU ETS 2 over time. This should be combined with complementary and targeted measures to address adverse socioeconomic impacts. The next recommendation refers to demand management. So we acknowledge here that the scenarios which underpin our advice for 2040 confirm that the policy approach that pursues reduction in demand for energy and materials can enable faster reduction with higher co-benefits. So far, the EU policy framework has primarily concentrated on the supply side and on the technologies. Demand side measures have been either absent or ineffective, and therefore we think that demand side measures, also improving energy efficiency, is an important step forward. Next recommendation. Now, I already highlighted the importance of the agricultural sector, and you see here again the structural greenhouse gas emissions in the agriculture, but also the second aspect, a rapid decline of EU's net carbon sinks since 2010. So this is, from our point of view, a very an important reason for concern. So the declining carbon sinks are mainly because of EU forests are absorbing less and less carbon as they are getting older and facing worsening impacts from climate change. In addition, the current incentive for biomass use add a further pressure on the forest carbon sinks, and the climate costs of wood harvesting is insufficiently reflected in its price. So in both sectors, there are currently little or no financial incentives for farmers and land managers to reduce emissions and to increase removals. And therefore, we recommend to start preparing for the introduction for some form of emissions pricing in these sectors, and to implement also a mechanism which allows to reward the enhancement of carbon sinks. Yeah, so this is our set of policy recommendations. And here, this is again an overview what we have done so far, and what are our recommendations comparing the needs and the policy gaps. I thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Edenhofer, for the presentation. And now we will move to the questions and answers session. I will hand over to my colleague Rasmus Sangil from the Secretariat to keep track of those questions and pass them on then to Professor Edenhofer. So Rasmus, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And if you want to ask a question, please raise your virtual hand. You'll find that in the top bar on your screen. And then we will address the questions in the order the hands are raised. And we will focus on questions asked orally. So please refrain from using the chat for submitting questions. Each person is allowed to ask up to 2 questions, and we would kindly request that you ask both questions before the chair provides the answers. And once the floor is given to you, please introduce yourself and also state the organization you're representing if that is the case. So now for the questions. The first participant to raise a virtual hand is Wendel Trio.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Professor, for this very interesting presentation of a very, very good report. I have one rather simple question. As you know, in the run-up to COP28, EU environment ministers through the Environment Council agreed on a mandate to call for the end or a phase out of fossil fuels globally. That has not really been fully adopted at the COP, but it would be consistent for the EU to also set its own phase-out dates for fossil fuels, be it together or be it for specific fossil fuels. A number of member states do have such phase-out dates, in particular for coal. I noticed that you didn't recommend any such policies to be set, and I was wondering whether that has been discussed and what would be the reasons not to include setting strict dates for the full phase-out of fossil fuels in the EU.
Thank you. And I think we'll have 1 or 2 more questions before I hand over the floor to Ottmar. The next on my list is Nick Evans.
Hi, can everybody hear me all right?
Sure.
Yes, thank you very much for this fantastic report and for the presentation. I have two questions, both related to recommendation 6 on governance and the EU governance framework. The first is that you recommend that these be in place by 2031 at the latest. Of course, at the latest is an important qualifier, but this seemed just on my immediate impression as being a bit late, given that, of course, getting these processes in order now and the importance of learning over time to make sure that they're actually fully implemented and sufficiently implemented as soon as possible would seem to be important to make sure actions are actually in line, current actions are in line with long-term thinking. Along those lines, my second question pertains to the recommendation that the consistency between the long-term strategies and the NECPs be ensured via some mechanism at EU level, whether this is a check despite it already being required. And my question is actually how there's also this need to have the LTS, as the European Climate Law, amends the governance regulation, so the LTS must also be consistent with climate neutrality. And my question is, how can the EU ensure that the LTSs at member state level are consistent with climate neutrality if there isn't a clear vision for what climate neutrality means at EU level? So I'm speaking to an actual strategy at EU level for climate neutrality and a vision for it. That's I would think that would need to be up to date, or at least based on the latest scientific understanding, in order to do that assessment effectively. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll now hand it over to Ottmar to answer those questions.
Yeah. So first, I start with the phase out of the fossil fuels. So what we did here is we basically highlighted the goal for emission reduction, And we did this based on scenarios. So we filtered 1,000 scenarios and end up then in the end with 7 scenarios. So in that sense, and all the scenarios have some flexibility for the phase out. And so the most important thing is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 2040 between 90 to minus 95%. So so this scenario see a sharp decline, and there are a small volume of fossil fuels, in particular oil, available by 2050, mainly for non-energy use. For the electricity sector, we do see under the most scenarios, fossil fuel goes almost to zero by 2040. But so the report therefore clearly recommends to be consistent with this with the scenarios. But so when we think about that, enhancing the emission trading schemes across the sectors, so then I think the most important thing is that we go for this for the emission reduction goal and allow so the system for sufficient flexibility, because in the end, what matters for a climate policy is the amount of emissions and the carbon budget. So the next question is about the which is also quite important, the issue of a clear vision of climate neutrality within the EU, and I assume that here you are in particular referring to the question, what is the importance of an own CDR target? I'm not in a position today to say too much about this, because we are preparing a report on CDR, where we will definitely discuss this vision on climate neutrality. Referring to 2031, so this is a set of recommendations refer to policies that will be revised when EU legislators discuss the post-2030 policy framework that has to be in place by then. So, but certain policies could be implemented before that date. Yeah, so that's what from my point of view is what I would like to highlight here. Yeah, I think that's for the time being so good enough.
Thank you, and we'll now move to next questions. I have a very short list with only one person on the list so far. So while Sult Lenkul asks his question, you can possibly think of other questions to ask. Sult, I'll leave the floor to you.
Thank you very much. I mean, I have multiple hats. I'm an auditor. I'm also a board member of the Institute for European Energy and Climate Policy. And my first question has already been answered by Ottmar with respect to the CDR report, which I guess is a novelty to many of us. And then my question is that when this report is coming forward. But my initial question is really related to agriculture. I think one of the elephants in the rooms, which I think you have already made it very, very big and very, very explicit. But my particular question relates to the fact how you assessed consistency of policies and whether you have looked at the CRCF, which is coming up, which is in the making, which is a voluntary measure. And I think you have argued very, very strongly how agriculture and also forestry really needs to be made very, very strong and mandatory targets in this setup, whether it's through an ETS inclusion or through carbon pricing or looking at the carbon of the common agricultural policy, I guess is of secondary nature. So my question is really, what would be the 15 strong group of experts recommending to the European Commission and to the member states of how to get really, really serious on agriculture and forestry, where we are lagging behind and where I think you have already appropriately criticized the present regulatory setup. Thank you.
Yeah, I think. So sorry. So Rasmus, so you asked for a next set of questions, right?
Yes, there are no more on the list, so please, you can just go ahead and answer the question that was just asked.
Okay, good. Now I can basically start with one aspect here is on agriculture. So in the report we haven't figured out what does it mean to, or what is the best way to regulate and to price emissions in the agriculture sector, and what is the best way to incentivize carbon removal. So this will be done in the CDR report, and we will also have a report on agriculture. Here in this report, we said this has to be done, this is important, but we have been quite agnostic how to do this precisely. So that's something which has to be done. And then we can be a little bit more precise how the alignment of the common agricultural policy could look like. So on your question on the CRSCF, this could indeed provide a framework on how to monitor and to verify carbon removals, but it is by no means sufficient, and it is not a strong incentive structure for the CDR. So here we ask for much stronger measures. So reviewing the CAP, introducing the greenhouse gas emission pricing, and also so this complicated questions for CDR. So here we have to take into account that some of the CDR are permanent, some of the removals are non-permanent. So what are the pricing issues, and also how to regulate the non-CO2 emissions, fertilizer, livestock. So this is a huge package which we will analyze. And so you ask also when will the CDR report be published. It's not finally decided, but we will let you know right in advance when the report is ready. But we will do this in 2024.
All right, thank you. And we have another question from David Howell.
Hello, thank you very much for this opportunity. I have a question related to the recommendation on the multi-level stakeholder dialogues, where I represent BirdLife, a European-wide network of bird and nature conservation organizations. And this, as I'm sure you know, has been a concern of civil society generally, that the levels of participation in the development of the initial NECPs were entirely insufficient, and that not only have the draft updates sometimes been arriving late, but again, we've seen quite deficient attempts by member states, sometimes zero attempts by member states to involve a wide variety of stakeholders in a structured dialogue. So my question there, in welcoming your recommendation, my question is whether the advisory board did any sort of attempt to measure change, to see whether member states were actually changing from before the introduction of the governance regulation, which introduced first this requirement for multi-level stakeholder dialogues, or simply it's been a look at the current situation as of 2023, 2024. So have you detected any movement in a good direction or a bad direction in some member states in making this recommendation? Thank you.
Good, and I'll now hand it over to you, Oddmar, for the response.
Yeah. So before I answer that question in detail. So first, we did not look in detail into implementation of member states. So this is beyond our capacity. But the European Commission has pointed out the lack of participatory processes as one of the shortcomings in the draft of the updated national energy and climate plans. It is worthwhile also to embed this a little bit broader in this whole issue. So what can we do to ensure and to improve the alignment between member states and the EU, or the member states' long-term plans and the long-term strategies? So a first element would be to have more clarity how the EU will achieve its long-term goal. So we will see in just a few weeks if the communication of the EU Commission on the EU 2040 target provides more details on such a vision. And in addition, it seems to me it is essential that member states outline more clearly not only how they want to reach the ambitious 2030 target, but also they should also put these plans in a long-term perspective, and also explain what kind of policy instruments they intend to implement. So, and it would be then for the Commission to assess the consistency here. So it seems to me that is something which is required, and this iterative process could do here, could strengthen the commitment, also the consistency of the plans.
Thank you. And I see no more raised hands. I don't know, are there any more questions from the participants? We still have plenty of time, but if it's not the case, then I see one more from Sult Lengül.
Yeah, as others are getting ready with their questions, I'm just taking the floor for asking a quick feedback on the separation, the potential separation of reduction and removal targets in the 2040 setup, which we understand has been put forward by a large number of CDR players. I'm just very, very interested to hear something about this, if you have already developed a view which goes into those intricate details what Ottmar you mentioned as to be covered by the forthcoming reports. So if possible, I would be very interested in your views, but I also understand that this might be a too early question. Thank you.
Yeah, so this is indeed a too early question, because we haven't we haven't even discussed this issue in detail, and we have no consensus. And as the chair of the European Scientific Advisory Council on climate change, I only want to speak on behalf of the whole board, and we will speak about the issue when we have published the report. So here I have to I have to admit I cannot. It's a too early question, and I am not in a position to explain how we think about this separate CDR targets and the concrete vision of climate neutrality. So here I refer to our next webinar on the next report.
And there's another question now coming from Guido Noce.
Yeah, hello, good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Ottmar, for this nice introduction to your report. I have one question. You mentioned an oncoming report on CO2 removal in the coming months. Is there any date known from your side? Can you tell us? Thank you.
Not the precise date is not decided yet.
Okay, thanks.
Good. And do we have another question from Sefbarovic? I saw a hand, but then it disappeared.
So it's still there. Elena Zitarovic from the GRC.
Good, thanks.
We cannot hear you or see you, Elena.
I think we might move to David Howell then, and then Elena, please come back if you still have a question to ask.
Thank you for the opportunity to come back. To pick up on one of the other recommendations regarding the land use sector, in particular agriculture emissions, where it's very clear that as a sector that we're not seeing the progress that's needed, and again it's good to see that very clear recognition, a clear message for EU agriculture ministers, the new agriculture committee in the parliament, and for the actors in the sector. Let's see if they listen to it. My question is about the recommendation on introducing these emissions into the ETS, if I've understood that correctly. Or maybe I haven't understood that correctly. But how are we? How, from the board's point of view, are you seeing the right mechanisms to guarantee these emissions, particularly given emission reductions, particularly given the methodological problems of quantifying land use emissions, and secondly the question of permanence of land use emissions. How has the board looked at these kind of technical questions in trying to guarantee land use emissions? Forgive me if I've misunderstood the thing about the ETS. I understood you were recommending that these emissions should come into the ETS.
Yeah. First of all, let me clarify a potential misunderstanding. We did not argue for including the emissions in the agriculture sector into one of the ETS systems. So we talked about pricing emissions in the agriculture sector, and here we highlighted that there are different options, but here we thought there should be a different pricing scheme because it would be too risky to include the agriculture sector in the other sector. So that seems to me is very important. And here we have recommended in more general terms two aspects here: pricing emissions, but also, and this should not be ignored, in incentivizing removals. And when we talk about the incentives for the carbon dioxide removals, of course, the non-permanence issue is one important issue, and if a removal is non-permanent, so this has to be then also reflected in the pricing scheme. Again, this is something which we will discuss in much more detail on CDR, but the most important thing for us in this report was first acknowledging that there was no structural change in the agriculture sector. Emission reduction has to be incentivized. And secondly, the carbon dioxide removal rewards are also quite important. And here CDR could also be an additional, let's say, bargaining chip in this whole debate, because CDR could also, at least to some extent, generate new income sources for farmers, and then this could allow also to accept this kind of regulation and pricing in the agricultural sector. But so we want to highlight here in this report that there are two worrying factors. The one is the unchanged or the almost stable emissions since 2005, and secondly the declining sinks. And we even highlighted that the declining sinks has the potential to undermine the 2030 target. So, and therefore, it is very important to start to revert this trend.
Thank you. And we'll now try again with Elena Seferich from the JRC.
No, sorry, I had some issues with Teams. It stopped. So thank you so much for the very interesting and insightful presentation, and it shows that you clearly, got very deep insights. Listening to your presentation, I got the impression that the overall tone of your report is we're doing well, but not enough. And I would like to ask your confirmation, or if you could if I got this right, if this is the message you want to send.
Yeah, so we want to send two messages. The first message is, so we are in a position to achieve almost the 2030 target, but given the current plans, we are losing momentum after 2023. It's 2030, and this is the really important thing. So we are good for the target by 2030, but afterwards, so when it comes really to the very long-term issue, so we need to close the gaps decisively and effectively. So in that sense, it should not be a report which should create a kind of a depression or too much pessimism, but it should also encourage the civil society and the policymakers to close these gaps. And a lot of work is ahead of us, but but we have to work hard to keep on track.
Okay, so it's call for action. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And do we have any more questions? Don't seem to have any more on my list. So
one thing I would like to highlight to add a component. So in this report, we are not saying what has been done very often in the arena of climate policy. Let's have more ambitious targets. So we are here talking about make the policies consistent, implement them decisively. So it's very much an implementation report. So it might be for some people, for the broader audience, for this reason, a little bit boring. My feeling is it's a very exciting report, because in this report we identified the gaps, and we also made recommendations how to fill the gaps. So it's also a report on encouragement.
thank you. And just to make sure, Elena, is that a new hand, or do you have another question? Otherwise, we'll pass the floor to
the old hand.
Sara Versano.
Yes, good afternoon. Sara Versano from EURIMA, European Insulation Manufacturers Association. We talked about carbon removal for a bit now, but we mainly focus on agriculture. So I wanted to make a question about the forestry situation, and specifically on the link with the carbon storage in products. We know that in the carbon removal certification framework, this is one of the activities or of the elements included in the scope. And unfortunately, we can see that there is still the mention to temporary storage, and the definition of permanent or long-term storage are not really there. So I wanted to ask a comment on that, and also if there are any reflection on the implication that the push that we can see at the moment to the wood-based products in many sectors, including in the framework of the new European Bauhaus that is already in plan for the next Commission. How do you see the implication for forest and carbon sink in soil and stuff like that? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Again, this is an issue which we will handle in detail in one of the next reports. But one thing I would like to highlight, when we are talking about CDR, definitely we talk about land-based CDR, but not only on land-based CDR. So also on technical CDR like direct air capture and carbon capture and storage. So that's also included here. And the forests is an important issue. So we did not analyze this in detail, but all the questions you have raised in particular. So this is something which we will highlight in our CDR report.
Thank you. And if there's any more questions, please come forward. I don't see any more questions. And if that's the case, then I'll pass the floor to the head of the Secretariat, François Dejean, for the closing remarks.
Thank you, Rasmus. Thank you, Professor Edenhofer, and thanks to all of you for your active participation in this exchange. We'd like also to extend our thanks to those of you who followed us on our website. And this webinar has been recorded and will be shared, so it's possible also to listen to it later. If you have any follow-up question, you are of course welcome to get in touch with the Secretariat, and you will find contact information on the advisory board's website. So with this, and a bit ahead of time today, but I understand this is a very substantial report with a lot of conclusions that might take a bit more time to fully digest. So we look also forward to further exchanges and opportunities to engage with the public and the civil society. But with this, I would like to close this webinar and wish you all a very good rest of the afternoon. Thank you very much.